Hello and thank you. Welcome back to our ILTV News Podcast. This is Mayan Hoffman, Executive Editor, and I'm very thrilled today to have a special guest with us, Jonathan Conricus. He's a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and as well a former IDF spokesperson. Thank you so much for being here.
Shalom.
So there's so much going on in the news. There's always things that we can talk about. And I think it's especially interesting to talk today because we're in the cusp of the American elections, the potential Iranian response. We've been told the response will not come before the elections. The response will not come too far or too close, immediate after the elections. But we still know that it's going to come soon. I guess my question is, when is it going to come? What are you hearing? And what is it going to look like?
So when I assess the Iranians and when I assess what makes sense for them to do, it doesn't make sense for them to strike at Israel again and to attack Israel again because they are very exposed and very vulnerable. So if I were them, I would tone down the rhetoric and I would be very careful because at the end of the day, if they strike Israel again, and this would be the third act of aggression, direct act of aggression against Israel, April 13th and 14th, October 2nd, and then an additional one. What essentially would happen is that Israel would not only have the justification to do much more than we did last time, but also the situation on the ground now is that Iran, its capital, its most important military infrastructure, its nuclear sites, its economic infrastructure, all of that is now exposed because what the IDF did, Israeli Air Force did the last round, was to peel away almost all strategic air defenses. So the Iranians can talk tough, they can say stuff, but in terms of actually doing anything, I would be very surprised if they actually mustered the courage to do it, and I think it would be a very unwise thing to do. Something in me hopes for them to do it because I think it is definitely time that we switch the balance in the Middle East and we actually start holding the Iranian regime accountable for their actions and for their aggression, for how they're destabilizing the Middle East. And if they attack Israel again, then Israel would have a very good opportunity to do so. I do, however, think that the time between American elections and inauguration, many people refer to this as the lame duck period, is a time that we will likely see enhanced volatility. It makes a lot of sense, both for Israel and for Iran, to try to establish new rules and a new reality in that period. And regardless of who wins the American elections, and that's a super important, critical topic, whoever wins, I think that the coming period will be one where all sides will try to shape and influence and kind of set reality before the next administration is sworn in.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because if there continues to be this sort of tit for tat, I mean, at some point it needs to escalate. What you were talking about with the IAF, the Air Force going in and taking out a lot of the strategic targets and making it so that Iran is sort of exposed. But doesn't that mean that we could potentially go in and attack their nuclear facilities? We'd have much more ability to do that. So if this continues, might we decide to make that move once and for all?
First of all, yes, Israel can do that. Questions about how effective such a strike would be and how high the percentage of damage to the Iranian military nuclear program would be. Debatable. The Iranians, they learned the lessons from Iraq in 1981 and Deir ez-Zor in 2007. So their nuclear military program is clandestine, it is dispersed, it is hardened, and it's deeply defended underground. And in order for Israel to be able to actually make long-term strategic damage to that program, Israel needs ordnance, big, heavy 20,000-pound bombs that currently are not at Israel's disposal. I think that what Israel would be able to do would be to deliver a significant blow to the Iranian nuclear military program. Not sure that Israel would be able to take it out in its entirety. And I'm not sure that that would be the wisest thing to do because it would kind of invite additional Iranian steps and it could escalate the situation in a way that wouldn't be good for Israel. I would actually be focusing much more on the Iranian regime. I think that is the pivot. When you take stock of the entire situation in the Middle East and when you look at different scenarios, it really comes back to the center of gravity being the Iranian regime, that they still have the ability, the money, the time and the energy to continue to promote both nuclear weapons and their strategy of the Ring of Fire around Israel, and basically promoting terrorist organizations all around the Middle East, and of course trying to do all kinds of offensive operations in Europe and the US to assassinate dissidents and to bully people into submission. The bottom line is the regime. And
the way to get rid of it, I'm assuming, is to take out the energy infrastructure, the oil, the money.
That would be part of it. But what I think is happening these days in Israel is that for the first time the Israeli establishment is actually looking at the Iranian topic with, I'd say, a fresh perspective and saying, okay, let's bring it to them. Let's see how we can apply pressure on the Iranian regime. Economic is one. But let's also try to support the Iranian people. Let's support the Iranian people, which for many years has been suffering under this oppressive, brutal regime. There are tens of millions of Iranians. I wouldn't say that all Iranians are against the regime, but I would say that there's a big, significant part of Iranian society that absolutely despises the regime. Not because they're unpatriotic, but because the regime is brutal. It is oppressive. It oppresses women. It oppresses minorities. It oppresses anybody that doesn't follow the very strict interpretation of Islamic rule that they want to have. And it's a horrible regime. It is also corrupt. It isn't providing future prospects, not providing prosperity, not providing security, and it is oppressive. And the Iranians have taken to the streets multiple times, 2016, and many times in between. And then, of course, the Mahsa Amini protests that started 2 years and a month ago. And that's still ongoing. There's a lot of unrest. And I think what the West should be doing under U.S. leadership, but until the U.S. gets around to doing that, what Israel is doing is actually thinking about that strategy of helping the Iranian people and opposing the regime. Once that happens, that can set into motion a lot of positive things that would really influence the Middle East, because doing kinetic action against the Iranian nuclear program is one thing, but I think it's limited in terms of its scope. And attacking the regime itself and supporting the Iranian people is of total different dimensions, and I think the much smarter and long-term thing to do.
Sure, because of course the people can help to overthrow their own regime probably more effectively than anybody else can. Now, you mentioned the U.S. elections, and I don't want to touch on it too much because if this comes out in a day or two, maybe we'll actually know who will be the next U.S. president, though it's actually hard to say because we might be waiting a week to get these results. Yep. If we remember the last one, it took, 5 days till we knew who actually won the election. But you mentioned that it depends who gets into office. What will be most important, how that will impact Israel, certainly impact the way we manage Iran. So what are your thoughts? Trump versus Harris, are you supporting a candidate if you're allowed to do that? And which do you think would be better for Israel's security specifically?
Without going into specific names and endorsements, I'll say this. The most important part from an Israeli perspective is what will the incoming administration's policy towards Iran be? Not the Palestinians and not other things that are important in the Middle East. Those are secondary from my point of view. The American policy towards the Iranian regime is the centerpiece of American foreign policy in the Middle East. And I've been listening to both candidates and their teams. I've been looking at who is slated for key national security appointments. And I think that I hope that both administrations will do what's right for America. After all, America cares about America, and as they should. And I think that at this time, Israeli interest and American interest in terms of stabilizing the Middle East, getting rid of the biggest state supporter of terrorism, and actually building a American-led alliance, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other countries, which will promote prosperity, trade, energy, basically along the lines of the Biden Jerusalem declaration that President Biden came here to Israel when Lapid was prime minister, and they signed an agreement where, and it's interesting to keep in mind that President Biden, Democratic president, he signed and specifically said that the U.S. would use all its instrument of national power in order to prevent Iran from going nuclear. And I think a written statement by a U.S. president should have that kind of weight. So I hope that that'll be carried on by whatever administration comes, and that the people appointed will be focusing on that. But I think that the convergence here of interest, U.S. interest and Israeli interest, peace and prosperity interest in the Middle East, for me it all makes sense that the U.S. will have a tough, unwavering posture towards Iran, towards the Iranian regime, one that helps the people and wants to alleviate them from their oppression and bring stability, quiet and prosperity to the Middle East. It is possible, but there has to be a strong will and a clear strategy, and to actually say it out loud. Iran is the destabilizer of the Middle East. It is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. And since it calls America the big Satan and calls for the destruction of America after it destroys Israel, I think the U.S. should be operating accordingly. And I hope that both administrations will, or the administration that eventually is elected, will implement that.
So let's shift a little bit to Gaza. There's a lot of confusion going on right now around the numbers. I recently saw that, we've dropped the number of Hamas operatives that we believe we killed. It went from 20,000 to 15,000. How do we get these numbers wrong? Let's start with that. I mean, we're always talking about the Hamas-led health ministry misreporting, but here we've apparently misreported. And if it is so many fewer people, I mean, it's 5,000, it's not a tiny number, then what does that mean in terms of our effectiveness? What have we actually done effectively in terms of dismantling Hamas in Gaza?
Yeah, from a military perspective, Hamas is, I'd say, down but not out yet. As we can see, they're still fighting ongoing in Jabalia. Wherever Palestinian civilian population is allowed to live, then Hamas uses that and establishes itself again. I think it's the third or almost the fourth time that Israeli troops actually engage with terrorists in Jabalia since October 7. So there's obviously still work to be done. But on a strategic level, to be clear, Hamas is nowhere near what it was on October 7. It has no strategic weapons left. It has zero production capabilities. It is extremely limited, if not totally without replenishment capabilities. They can't get weapons in. And in terms of personnel, which is what you spoke about, they're in a bad place. Now, numbers, and I said this early on when I was still in uniform, and I said it in behind closed doors meetings in the IDF, this will be a numbers game. And if we don't get our numbers straight, and if we don't monitor and actually allocate intel resources in counting dead enemy combatants and counting dead civilian or non-combatant casualties, then the other side will use it against us.
And they already are.
And they've been doing that since day 2. 100%. They've been doing it effectively. They've gotten lots of help from, I would say, unprofessional journalists and editors and from elected officials who have readily taken the number that Hamas provided and used
40 some odd thousand, that's got to be the number.
Which is a lie.
Right.
40,000 people, and to claim that 40,000 people, most of them women and children, that's usually what's attached to it, have been killed, is simply a lie. And that is something that I think it's so lazy of journalists, editors and elected officials around the world to be using this and quoting this as if that was true. Surely people have died, definitely. And yes, civilians have been killed. But in terms of combatants versus non-combatants, that ratio, I think Israel is still, let's say, the conservative assessment of 17,000 enemy combatants killed, maybe 18,000 enemy combatants killed. When you compare that to the total amount of people killed, it is still as horrible as it sounds. And when we think of every number as a person, it is still the, quote, best ratio between combatant and non-combatant achieved by any military fighting a terrorist organization in densely populated urban terrain. It is sad. And it is horrible that people die that aren't related to fighting. I see suffering in Gaza, and I think there's a challenge, a significant challenge there. And there's, I would say, a lot of humanitarian work that needs to be done. But in terms of numbers, what I think we have not been doing well from the beginning is allocating the brain power and intel resources to count combatant and non-combatant casualties, and to have that front and center to actually be able to debate and undermine the lies that Hamas has been posting and that most international media have been using.
Yeah, and it is true. I mean, I remember even in the beginning with the number of people who were killed on the Israeli side, we started with 1,500, we went down to 1,300, then we said 1,200. We've never really changed that number, despite the fact that we found that many of the people who were taken to Gaza were also dead.
Yeah.
So we don't really even know, I think, the accurate number of October 7th, though now we know the soldiers and the...
I mean, now we have, I think, a very good named list of Israeli casualties. I think we have to remember that the carnage and the actual physical challenge of finding, without getting into too gruesome details here, but really finding human remains and matching DNAs, it took a lot of work and it's unprecedented.
Right.
No country the size of Israel has ever faced such a challenge to have to identify so severely misfigured bodies and human remains. Many bodies were, as we remember, they were burnt and mutilated, etc. And many of the body parts were scattered on an area of many square miles. Right. That's one of the reasons why it took Israel so long. And the assessments that got out were, as you said, they were dynamic. But I think that today that's been established, the amount of Israeli civilians murdered, the amount of security forces killed. And it's out and official on Israeli sites. But where Israel hasn't done well enough by itself is to speak about enemy casualties and civilian casualties on the other side. That should have been better from the beginning.
Now, what about these 101 hostages? We still have 101 hostages in Gaza. We're talking about the ceasefire with Lebanon, which ultimately could lead to some kind of ceasefire of sorts in Gaza, but yet these people have not come home. Are we going to get them back?
So first part of, the making that link between Lebanon and Gaza is something that Israel definitely wants to sever. We definitely want to detach Hezbollah's aggression against Israel and the situation in Lebanon and Hamas's aggression against Israel and the situation in Gaza. We do not want to strengthen that link, and even if we separately establish some kind of end of hostilities, ceasefire with Lebanon, that's great, but the situation in Gaza is, I would say, independent of that, and in terms of Israeli strategic wisdom, we want to separate between the two.
Well, Israel wants to, but from day one, really, from October 8th, they've been linked.
Yeah, but you can see that there's positive development here, whereby for about a year, until things started getting tough for Hezbollah, they were all about that it's the same front and that we will not detach ourselves from the situation in Gaza. Things started getting tough for Hezbollah. Their leadership was killed and they suffered a lot of casualties on the battlefield. All of a sudden now, it's about 1701 and there's flexibility. Why? Because Israel has been able to inflict pain on Hezbollah. They're suffering. There's a lot of Shiite refugees in Lebanon. And as such, the positions are more flexible. And we need to continue to push it that way, because what we need versus Hezbollah and the Lebanese state is one thing, and what we need in Gaza is another. Now, regarding the hostages, I think there are two big, tremendous failures that are related to Israel. One is October 7. How did the entire defense establishment, the political echelon, the military, everybody who had any type of responsibility for defending the state of Israel, how could we have failed so badly, and why didn't we protect our civilians? Number one. Number two, hostages. 252 were taken. We've gotten back, I think it's 154 in deals and very brave rescue operations, but there are still 101 left. Out of those 101, according to official information, 36 are sadly confirmed dead, and their families have been notified by authorities, and then there are big question marks about the rest of them. I think that many mistakes have been made by Israel, but even if we'd been even smarter and better and more focused and allocated more resources, at the end of the day, this is the zero-sum game that Hamas is playing. They are leveraging the hostages, and they know that this is probably the only thing that will allow Hamas as an organization to continue to exist after the war against Israel ends. And Israel isn't willing to give that away. Israel is saying, well, we want our hostages back, but we're not going to allow Hamas any type of anything else but a defeat, so not a tie and definitely not a victory, in return for the hostages. And it's a very cold, strategic calculation. I think the wound in Israeli society and global Jewry is a tremendously deep and sensitive wound. This will be long-lasting, and the effect on Israelis will be profound for generations. I do, however, think that what Israel needs to be doing is to defeat Hamas, to annihilate them militarily, and to make sure that they never ever again are able to not even exist and definitely not threaten Israel, and that they are made an example. And this is really important, and the only thing that, of course, it won't justify the suffering of the families and the horrible fate of the hostages, but the only thing that I can think that would have some kind of positive outcome is whether the humiliation and the suffering of Hamas and anybody who supported Hamas is so grave and so significant that any terrorist that will try to even think of conducting or abducting Israelis again will say, well, if that's where that road leads, if it eventually brings me to total ruin and destruction, if my organization is dismantled and all of the ecosystem that supported me, civilians, etc., will be ruined, then let's not go that way because the price is too big.
Do you believe this is going to happen, that that's going to be the message that comes out of this war?
I believe that many Palestinians are already feeling it. I believe that the ecosystem of terror organizations, the Iranian ring of fire around Israel, and many jihadi organizations are watching Gaza and understanding that, well, October 7th wasn't very brilliant. It was a brilliant first tactical attack. They definitely handed Israel a very humiliating tactical defeat. But in terms of strategic wisdom, anybody looking at the Gaza Strip, anybody listening to the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, anybody trying to look for the remains of Hamas's leadership, I think will come to the conclusion that it wasn't very smart, because that organization is, probably if it ever is able to regain a foothold in Gaza, it'll take a long time. Where I am cautious is, when we look at Israeli military history, the last time that we actually defeated an enemy or enemies was in Yom Kippur, 1973. And even then, eventually, when the IDF achieved battleground dominance and were close to defeating our enemies, the Soviets intervened and threatened to get involved, and that effectively stopped Israeli operations both on the Golan and 101 kilometers from the Egyptian capital. And that's essentially what saved them. Otherwise, Israel would have been able to go further and actually defeat those enemies. Since then, I don't think that we've really been either able to or been allowed to actually defeat enemies. For the first time now, we're defeating one enemy, Hamas. We're doing good work with Hezbollah, but nowhere near really defeating, as in breaking the enemy's will to fight, and actually having the enemy come up with the white flag and say, I surrender, which is the classic military definition of defeating an enemy. That is not really where they are. And I think it is sad that we haven't been allowed by supporters, allies, and probably also ourselves to actually defeat our enemies. And I think it's this war is so important strategically, long-term speaking, because that needs to be the message that comes out. You can perhaps catch us off guard and deal a very humiliating and painful blow to Israel, but at the end of the day, it'll cost you your organization and it'll cost you your future.
Now, I want to get a little bit personal, if that's okay. I mean, I think people would love to know a little bit more about you. We've been watching you, for the better part of more than a year. You mentioned before you have 4 kids. Tell me, a little bit about yourself, how you got into becoming a spokesperson.
Well, I started my military service at the age of 18, like I would like to say all Israelis do, but today it isn't all Israelis. It is approximately half of the Israeli population. When I was 18, it was more than that, around 60%. So I started my military service as an infantry soldier in Givati.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my first 2 years of service in combat were in Lebanon. before we withdrew from southern Lebanon, so the Beaufort Castle and a few other locations, which was the first time that I came under fire and actually saw, smelled, and could confront an enemy. It was Hezbollah at the time. It was a challenging period because the Israeli posture, the IDF posture, was a defensive, kind of crouched defensive, and I didn't like it. It was very... it was not the IDF that I had grown up studying, 6 Days War, Yom Kippur, brilliance and initiative, bravado. It was a different IDF, and that was my first experience. And then after I was commissioned as an officer, my first 5 years as an officer, as a platoon commander, then company commander, were in Gaza, in Givati. So all of the cities that we speak about, that so many people today know, Gaza City, Khan Yunis, Rafah, and many other places are places where I personally operated together with my troops. Where Yahya Sinwar was killed, Tel Sultan, I was actually the company commander responsible for that area many, many years ago.
Wow.
Which was interesting to see. I mean, it's grown significantly, but I remember the houses very well. And I, of course, served in all of the Israeli communities in the Gaza Strip. Since then, I've done other things, a little bit less shooting, more talking. Had the opportunity to liaise on behalf of the IDF to both UN peacekeeping and also do foreign relations with the US and other militaries, focused on combat doctrine, how to be better on the battlefield, how to learn from our activities and how to implement that in terms of institutional knowledge. And I was the first Israeli officer to be seconded to the UN. So I spent 3 years, very interesting years, at UN headquarters in New York on behalf of the State of Israel, the IDF, where I provided military assessment to UN peacekeeping related to different UN peacekeeping forces in Africa.
That's incredible.
It was very interesting and very, very enlightening to kind of be, from an Israeli perspective, in the belly of the beast, meet a lot of people who on the outside were polite and professional, but it was a very thin veneer of professionalism, and just below the surface, tremendous bias against Israel. I would even say many people were outright anti-Semitic, but biased against Israel. And even though many were nice, it was very, very enlightening because it explained to me how things are so warped at the UN, how Security Council resolutions are presented as they are, how the General Assembly works, and how UN peacekeeping operates. It's tremendously interesting, not very positive, but very interesting to see.
So we're going to start to run out of time, and I do want to get into more questions. I mean, one is honestly, you're an IDF spokesperson, or you were a former IDF spokesperson, and that's a representative, of course, of our army. And the international media to which you generally are talking to is very anti-Israel. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're very good looking, you're very charismatic, so I'm hoping that helps you, in that role. But is it also sort of like talking to the enemy, and how do you deal with that negative sentiment?
It's challenging because I compare to, how Israeli media listens to and relates to Dover Tzahal, IDF spokesperson, and then how the international IDF deals with international media. And it is very challenging because with Israel still, even though there are many parts of Israeli society that I think recklessly are undermining this and eroding really public trust and really doing very negative things today, Israeli media really attacking the IDF, attacking Israeli commanders, attacking the IDF spokesperson unit, which I think is beyond my understanding, except for rating and clickbait. I don't understand why they're doing it, but let's put that aside for a second. And generally speaking, when Dover Tzahal addresses the Israeli people, and we can see it according to polls, etc., he personally and the unit enjoys a very high level of credibility, which is earned. Not always perfect, but earned and definitely there. With international media, we're at a different starting point because it's always what we say versus what the other side says, right. Whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Authority, Iranians, whomever.
Yeah, everything's questioned.
Everything's questioned, and my biggest issue is, I'm a believer in democracy. I believe that media is super important to hold power accountable, and I think that media, free, independent, professional, and hard-biting media are super important and absolutely crucial for democracy to exist and to thrive, as we have in Israel, and as I think international media should be. And I think that a military spokesperson should be asked difficult and tough questions, professional ones. My issue is not that I and my peers were asked tough questions, but that it's all softballing on the other side.
Yeah.
That it's never equal, and that not only are we, by and large, held to higher, sometimes impossible standards of proving what we say, the other side is never questioned.
Right, we said 40,000 people dead. No problem.
And that's it. and then that's fact.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond that. And that, I think, eventually it saddens me, because so many journalists, few of them are brave and they take on their editors, and some of the media organizations have a different editorial policy where they actually look at Israel in a non-biased scenario. But most, I would say, judge us unfairly. And I think that they are eroding their own personal standards, their professional standards, by not being fair, by not asking the same questions, by not holding the other side accountable to their actions, by not having the understanding that the other side has agency, the other side has responsibility for their actions. They're always exempt, especially the Palestinians, always exempt.
The David and Goliath,
Yeah,
scenario.
it is. I mean, it's explainable from a psychological point of view, but it's still regrettable, because people around the world, they don't get the good service from a lot of international media, from the Wire Agency, AP, AFP, and Reuters. They are like the ground, the really ground level of where news is built, and many times the way that they frame it is how other media will cover it, and 9 out of 10 you'll see that cause and effect is mixed up. It's always about what Israel does, not what the other side did. So rockets will be fired at Israel will retaliate, and then the headline will be 5 Palestinians killed in Gaza in Israeli strike. Well, why did Israeli strike? And who were the 5 Palestinians killed? Were they combatants or not? Many of the times they are, but they're just referred to as Palestinians. And the previous episode of, okay, why did Israel strike? Well, because rockets were fired. But that's many times omitted. So cause and effect and chronology of events, many times omitted. And I think unfair and biased standards against Israel, and never holding the other side to the same standards that we are held.
So, Jonathan, last question. I mean, we're here now about almost 13 months, right? 13 months since the war has started. Look ahead for me. Take me another 11 months to the end of this next, to the end of the 2-year mark. In short, where are we going to be? Where do you see Israel ending up?
I think that we're at a watershed moment, and I think that we have crossed kind of a Rubicon. The Rubicon is a psychological one where for the first time we're directly engaging with the Iranian regime. And I think that's a good thing. Eventually, it will bring stability and prosperity to the Middle East, but the road ahead, the coming years, will be bumpy. I think that Israel will defeat Hamas, will oust Hamas from Gaza, and will eventually get its strategy right in order to totally change the equation in that area. Many obstacles. A lot of it also depends on the U.S. elections and what kind of American policy we will have coming out. But I see that changing in the long term. The remaining challenge will be Hezbollah, because we won't at this round be able to eradicate their military capabilities. And that will be an issue that Israel will have to deal with in the immediate future. What concerns me and worries me the most isn't our enemies. It's not the Iranian regime, it is not Hezbollah, and it's not what's left of Hamas, and not even Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. What concerns me is much more internal in Israeli society. It is what I think is lack of cohesion. It is the erosion of our common sense of destiny. And it is policies by this government that I think are absolutely reckless, specifically when it comes to sharing the burden of serving the country, of being a productive part of society, and of serving in the military, doing national duty, and then eventually being part of the workforce, paying taxes, and doing your fair share. I think that we can overcome, even though we face by far the biggest threat image that any country faces, Iran, and 7 fronts of fighting against Iran. At the end of the day, I think that we can defeat all of those. The only thing that can challenge really our strength is our internal dealings, and that is where I think most of the focus should be, on bringing Zionist, patriot Israelis together, set politics aside, get rid of politicians that prefer their personal interests over the national ones, and focus on building and strengthening and fortifying this beautiful country that we have.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. It has been such a pleasure to speak to you today.
Thank you, Marianne. A pleasure to be here.